When a narcissist makes what they call a final decision, it is rarely experienced internally as final. It is often delivered with dramatic certainty, a breakup, a discard, a betrayal, a declaration that they are done. The tone suggests closure. The words suggest permanence. But psychologically, there is often an unspoken assumption beneath it. This can be reversed. In many narcissistic dynamics, decisions are not endpoints. They are leverage. The declaration of undone is frequently a test, a maneuver, a power recalibration. It isn't meant to destabilize you, to provoke panic, to activate your attachment system. The expectation is not that you will accept it peacefully. The expectation is that you will protest. They anticipate tears, bargaining, emotional pursuit, attempts to fix what they just broke. That reaction confirms their significance. It reassures them that they still occupy the center of your emotional world. And here is where the shock begins. When you do not protest, when you do not chase, when you do not argue them out of their own decision, when you do not argue them out of their own decision, when you simply say, okay, that okay, lands heavier than any fight ever could, because for perhaps the first time, they are confronted with irreversibility. Irreversibility is destabilizing for someone who relies on emotional elasticity. Previous cycles, they may have withdrawn and returned. They may have discarded and hoovered. They may have threatened separation, only to later expect reconnection. But when you take their words at face value, when you honor the decision without resistance, you remove the elasticity, you close the loop. And psychologically, this is deeply unsettling. It forces them to experience something they did not plan for. Consequence without negotiation. The illusion of optionality disappears. The belief that they can always circle back begins to crack. What makes this so shocking is not simply the loss of the relationship. It is the loss of assumed access. They assumed access to your forgiveness, access to your longing, access to your willingness to re-engage. When that access is revoked, not angrily, not dramatically, but calmly, the nervous system registers something unfamiliar. This might actually be permanent. Permanence triggers anxiety because many narcissistic personalities operate from a deep fear of abandonment, even if they project that fear outward. By making the final decision, they were controlling the narrative. They were leaving before being left. They were positioning themselves as the chooser. But when you accept the decision without resistance, the power dynamic shifts. They are no longer the one controlling the ending. They are simply living inside it. There is also a philosophical dimension here. To live with one's final decision requires maturity. It requires integration. It requires tolerating regret if it arises. But if someone has structured their identity around avoiding vulnerability and maintaining superiority, regret feels intolerable. Regret implies fallibility. So instead of integrating the experience, they may initially deny its impact. They may convince themselves you will come back. They may tell others you are struggling without them. They may minimize the loss, but time introduces clarity. Days pass, weeks pass, you remain gone. Slowly, the realization sets in. They cannot undo this, not because you are punishing them, but because you believe them. You respected their words, and in doing so you remove the illusion that decisions are tools. They are now outcomes. The shock of irreversibility is the beginning of their psychological reckoning. It is the moment when performance turns into consequence, because nothing unsettles someone more than discovering that the door they slammed is actually closed. If we look closely at what often sits beneath the narcissist's final decision, we find something revealing. It was not simply a choice to end something. It was a calculated emotional move. There was an expectation embedded in it that you would chase. In many narcissistic dynamics, withdrawal is not about separation. It is about control. The threat of leaving, the dramatic discard, the cold declaration of I'm done, these are often designed to destabilize the other person. It activates fear, it triggers attachment anxiety, it creates urgency, and urgency is power. When someone panics at the thought of losing you, you feel significant. When they beg for reconsideration, you feel central. When they scramble to repair what you just broke, you feel chosen. That is the emotional payoff. So when they made that final decision, they likely imagined a familiar sequence. You would call, you would text, you would try to reason with them, You would defend your value. You would attempt to reopen the conversation. In other words, you would reinforce their importance. But when you don't, when you close the door instead of pushing it open, something destabilizing happens internally, because the power move doesn't land. The script fails. The nervous system, which anticipated validation through pursuit, encounters something entirely different: silence and acceptance. And acceptance is deeply unsettling in this context. Acceptance says, I believe you. Acceptance says, if this is your choice, I will respect it. Acceptance removes the drama. It removes the emotional chaos that would have reaffirmed their dominance. Instead of feeling pursued, they feel replaced. Instead of feeling central, they feel peripheral. That shift can be shocking, because the original decision was often delivered from a position of assumed superiority. The belief was, I am the one choosing to leave. But when you do not protest the departure, it reframes the entire dynamic. It suggests that you too had the capacity to leave. You simply chose not to, until they did. And now by not chasing, you communicate something quietly powerful. You are not dependent. This is where the psychological discomfort begins to deepen. The narcissist may begin to reinterpret their own decision. What once felt like strength now feels like miscalculation. What once felt like dominance now feels like loss of leverage. Because if you are not chasing, then the threat of leaving no longer works as a tool. And if that tool no longer works, their sense of control weakens. There is also something profoundly humbling in realizing that someone you expected to fight for you simply let you go. It challenges the narrative of indispensability. It confronts the assumption that you would always orbit back. It raises uncomfortable questions. Why aren't they fighting for me? Did they already detach? Was I not as central as I thought? These questions can stir insecurity beneath the surface, confidence. Philosophically, this is a confrontation with equality. In a narcissistic framework, relationships are often hierarchical. One person holds more emotional power. But when you refuse to chase, you level the field. You demonstrate that you are capable of choosing yourself over drama. And that equality can feel like rejection, because it exposes the truth. The relationship was not sustained by fate or inevitability. It was sustained by your willingness to stay. When that willingness disappears, the illusion of asymmetrical power dissolves. They expected pursuit. They expected protest. They expected emotional chaos that would reestablish their significance. Instead, they received dignity. Dignity is not something they can manipulate. The disbelief, then, is not about the breakup itself. It is about the unexpected role reversal. The one who attempted to create abandonment now feels the weight of it, because when you refuse to chase, you quietly communicate something transformative. I was not holding on to you because I had to it. I was holding on because I chose to. Because I chose to. And now I choose differently. When we move deeper into this dynamic, we begin to see that control was never as solid as it appeared. It was assumed. It was rehearsed. It was reinforced through repetition. But it was never guaranteed. In many narcissistic relationships, there is an unspoken hierarchy. One person believes they hold the emotional authority, the ability to dictate timing, to define reality, to decide when connection begins and ends. That authority is rarely negotiated openly. It is established through patterns: who apologizes first, who chases after conflict, who tolerates ambiguity, who absorbs blame. Over time, the narcissist begins to internalize a narrative. I control the narrative. They believe they determine when the relationship is warm or cold, when it is over or revived, when reconciliation is possible or denied. But this belief is fragile because it depends entirely on the other person cooperating with the script. When they made their final decision, there was an expectation embedded within it, not just that you would chase, but that you would remain emotionally available for future negotiation. Even if you resisted initially, the underlying assumption was that access would remain open. Access to your forgiveness, access to your longing, access to your emotional bandwidth. When you remove that access, the illusion cracks, because control was never about dominance and isolation. It was about influence within a responsive system. It required your participation. It required your willingness to remain in the loop. When you step out of that loop, the system destabilizes. This is where disbelief begins to morph into something heavier, a confrontation with limits. The narcissist begins to sense that their authority was not inherent. It was conditional. And conditional power is unsettling when you believed it was absolute. There is something psychologically destabilizing about realizing you cannot edit the ending, that you cannot rewrite the script, that you cannot call a timeout and expect the other person to pause their growth while you reconsider. They assumed they could dictate timing, but by living fully inside their own decision, by not reopening the conversation, you demonstrate something profound. Your life is not paused. Your life is not paused. This disrupts the power structure entirely. Because if you are not waiting, they are no longer the ones setting the tempo. And tempo is control. Times when someone loses the ability to influence pace, to slow you down, pull you back, or reinsert themselves at will. They begin to experience what feels like powerlessness, not because you attacked them, not because you sought revenge, but because you stopped participating in a hierarchy that was never formally agreed upon. You withdrew consent, and that withdrawal is deeply clarifying, exposes that their control existed only within a shared narrative. Once you rewrite your internal narrative, once you decide that their words are final and binding, you shift the locus of authority back to yourself. This is not rebellion. It is maturity. It is the quiet understanding that adults live with the consequences of their decisions. And when you hold them to their own words, you remove their ability to reinterpret them later. There is also an existential element here. For someone accustomed to bending reality, discovering that reality has boundaries can feel humiliating. It introduces accountability. It introduces permanence. It introduces the possibility that they are not the architect of every outcome. And that realization can be profoundly disorienting. Because if they cannot control this orienting, because if they cannot control this narrative, what else is outside their control? Ivor? That question lingers. Control was assumed, but not guaranteed. And when you step into your autonomy, you reveal that truth without saying a word. Because nothing dismantles the illusion of dominance faster than someone who calmly refuses to be managed. And in that refusal, the power dynamic doesn't explode. It simply dissolves. As time passes and the initial shock of irreversibility settles, something even more destabilizing can occur for the narcissist. They begin to see you doing well, not surviving, not barely coping, but genuinely rebuilding. And this is where the ego injury deepens. When they made their final decision, consciously or unconsciously, there was often an embedded fantasy. The fantasy was that you would struggle more than they would, that you would feel the loss more intensely, that their absence would create visible instability in your life. This belief protects the ego. It sustains the narrative of superiority. I am the prize. I am the one who walks away and leaves impact. But when you rebuild quietly, when you regain emotional stability, reconnect with yourself, pursue growth, and perhaps even radiate peace, that narrative collapses. Because your thriving reframes their decision. Because your thriving reframes their decision. What they framed as dominance begins to look like miscalculation. And calculation is hard for a narcissistic structure to tolerate. If your life improves without them, it suggests something deeply unsettling. They were not the stabilizing force they believed themselves to be. In fact, their presence may have been the destabilizing factor. That realization can feel humiliating. It challenges the grandiose self-image. It undermines the belief that they were indispensable. And it introduces a painful possibility that you did not lose them. You were released from something limiting. For someone organized around external validation, watching an ex-partner flourish can feel like erasure. If you are peaceful without them, then their emotional leverage dissolves retroactively. The conflicts they provoked, the drama they orchestrated, the chaos they framed as passion, all of it begins to look unnecessary. Unnecessary is threatening, because it suggests that the intensity they created was not evidence of depth, but evidence of dysfunction. There is also something psychologically piercing about your calm. Thriving does not require you to publicly announce success. It is often subtle. Healthier boundaries, clearer thinking, emotional regulation, genuine contentment. That calm communicates something without accusation. I am capable without you. And capability renews dependency. When dependency dissolves, so does the illusion of superiority. The narcissist may attempt to reinterpret your growth. They may minimize it. They may tell themselves you are pretending. They may attempt to provoke you to prove you are still affected. But consistency exposes truth. If months pass and you remain grounded, if your life continues to expand, if your energy is no longer entangled in their orbit, it becomes increasingly difficult to maintain the fantasy that they were the central pillar of your world. Instead, they must confront something more. The humbling, you were central by choice, not necessity. And once you chose differently, your world did not collapse. It reorganized. Philosophy. This is a confrontation with false hierarchy. The narcissistic ego depends on being above, more significant, more powerful, more impactful. But your thriving levels the field. It reveals that meaning in your life is not monopolized by their presence. This is not revenge. It is sovereignty. And sovereignty can feel like rejection to someone who equated control with connection. Your peace becomes evidence that you were stronger than they assumed, evidence that their final decision did not define you, evidence that your identity is not contingent on their validation. That evidence lingers and in that lingering the ego injury deepens, because nothing unsettles someone more than realizing the person they expected to break, rebuilt. Thriving is not loud. It is steady. And steady growth quietly dismantles every illusion of indispensability they once relied upon. Because when you flourish without them, you do not just survive their decision, you redefine it. As this process continues, something even more fragile begins to fracture. The fantasy self, the narcissist, quietly maintained throughout the relationship. Most narcissistic dynamics are sustained not just by control or manipulation, but by an internal mythology. In that mythology, they are unforgettable, irreplaceable, exceptionally impactful. The one you will always compare others to. The one whose absence will echo louder than their presence ever did. This fantasy is rarely spoken aloud, but it operates constantly beneath the surface. It reassures them that even if they discard you, you will remain psychologically tethered. That, even if they walk away, a part of you will always orbit them. When they made their final decision, that fantasy was stacked. They assumed they were exiting as the dominant figure in your story, the one whose shadow would linger. But when you adapt, when you grieve, process, and then continue forward, the fantasy begins to crack. Because reality does something mythology cannot withstand. It moves on. You meet new people. You rediscover parts of yourself that were muted. You experience moments of joy unconnected to them. And, slowly, they are no longer the emotional reference point in your life for someone invested in being unforgettable. This is destabilizing. The narcissistic fantasy self depends on being exceptional in your narrative. But when you stop centering them, when your healing no longer involves them as the primary character, their imagined status begins to erode. An erosion feels like diminishment. There is something profoundly unsettling about realizing you are not the epicenter of someone else's transformation. That the person you assumed would be haunted by you is becoming whole without you challenges the belief that they were uniquely powerful in shaping your emotional world. The collapse of the fantasy self is not dramatic. It is subtle. It happens in the quiet accumulation of evidence. Weeks where you do not reach out. Months where you no longer speak their name with intensity. Moments where they realize they are curious about your life, but you are no longer curious about theirs. That asymmetry is jarring because the fantasy relied on permanence, and permanence dissolves when someone chooses growth over nostalgia. There is also an existential dimension here. The narcissistic identity is often constructed around superiority, being more attractive, more intelligent, more emotionally complex, more impactful. But when you thrive and detach, you remove the audience that validated that superiority. Without that validation, the inflated self-image becomes harder to sustain. They may attempt to reinforce it elsewhere. New relationships, new admiration, new narratives. But the knowledge lingers. There exists at least one person who no longer sees them as central. That knowledge disrupts the fantasy. What makes this collapse particularly painful is that it exposes dependency in reverse. The one who positioned themselves as above the relationship begins to realize they were invested in being mythologized. Within it, they needed to be unforgettable. When you stop treating them as such, the myth weakens. Philosophically, this is a confrontation with humility. We are all replaceable in the broader arc of another person's life. Healthy love acknowledges this and chooses connection anyway. Narcissistic fantasy denies it and demands exceptionalism. When you refuse to preserve their legend in your inner world, you bring them back down to human scale, and human scale feels small to someone accustomed to grandeur. The collapse of the fantasy self is not something you orchestrate. It happens naturally when you redirect your energy inward and forward. And as that collapse unfolds, they are left facing a reality they never anticipated. They were not the defining chapter. They were simply a chapter. And the story continued. At a certain point in this unfolding, something unfamiliar begins to take shape for the narcissist. Consequence that cannot be negotiated. Up until now, much of their relational history may have been marked by reversibility. Words could be reframed. Narratives could be rewritten. Apologies could be strategically deployed. Blame could be shifted. If something fractured, it could often be bent back into place through charm, guilt, or confusion. But when you make them live with their final decision, something different happens. There is no revision. There is no reinterpretation of what the try really meant. There is no dramatic re-entry point where they reclaim authority over the ending. Instead, there is stillness. And in that stillness, consequence settles. For someone accustomed to manipulating perception, consequence feels foreign. It is not loud. It does not argue. It simply exists. Days pass without contact. Opportunities to reconnect do not present themselves. Life continues in a direction that does not include them. This is where the psychological discomfort deepens. Speculation relies on fluidity, on the belief that reality can be adjusted. But consequence is rigid. It does not bend to charisma. It does not respond to strategic messaging. It does not soften to strategic messaging. It does not soften because someone suddenly feels regret. It remains, and remaining is what forces reflection. When there is no one left to persuade, no one left to convince, no one left to destabilize, the narcissist is left sitting with their own choice. The final decision is no longer a performance. It becomes a lived experience. This can trigger an uncomfortable internal dialogue. Did I miscalculate? Was I too confident? Did I assume too much? These questions may not be voiced publicly, but they begin to surface internally. Because consequence introduces something that narcissistic defenses try to avoid. Accountability. Accountability implies that actions have outcomes independent of intention. It implies that declaring something final carries weight. It implies that other people have autonomy, that they can accept your words and act accordingly. And the autonomy disrupts the illusion of unilateral power. There is also something profoundly humbling about discovering that you cannot manipulate time. That once a door closes, it may not reopen on your schedule. That someone else's healing progresses without consulting you. Consequence is quiet, but it is firm. It does not accuse. It does not retaliate. It simply mirrors reality back. And reality, when stripped of distortion, can feel stark. The narcissist may attempt to soften this realization by constructing alternative narratives. They may tell themselves you were replaceable anyway, that they are better off, that the loss was minimal. But internal dissonance has a way of surfacing, especially when moments of loneliness arise, especially when they recognize that you truly moved forward. Consequence cannot be gaslit. It cannot be persuaded. It simply reflects the decision that was made. Philosophically, this is a return to adulthood. To live with one's decisions without rewriting them requires emotional maturity. It requires tolerating regret without projecting it outward. It requires acknowledging that freedom includes responsibility. When you make them live with their final decision, you are not punishing them. You are honoring their autonomy. And in doing so, you are reclaiming your own. Because the most destabilizing truth for someone who relied on manipulation is this. Once spoken, some decisions do not return for revision. They become reality. And reality, when accepted without negotiation, has a way of teaching lessons no argument ever could. There is another layer to this psychological unraveling that is more subtle, but in many ways more destabilizing. It's the confrontation with their own emotional dependency, the very dependency they projected onto you. In many narcissistic dynamics, there is an unspoken hierarchy. They position themselves as the independent one, the rational one, the one less attached. If you expressed hurt, you were too sensitive. If you asked for reassurance, you were too needy. If you wanted clarity, you were overthinking. The story was carefully arranged so that emotional gravity seemed to flow in one direction, from you toward them, from you toward them. But when you accept their final decision and do not chase, beg, argue, or attempt to reopen the conversation, something begins to invert. Silence has a way of exposing attachment. When you do not reach out, when you do not react, when you do not attempt to pull them back into dialogue, they are left alone with a discomfort they did not anticipate. And that discomfort is not about power. It is about absence. Because beneath grandiosity, there is often a fragile nervous system that depends heavily on external regulation. Attention regulates it. Conflict regulates it. Validation regulates it. Validation regulates it. Even your distress regulated it. It confirmed that they mattered, that they had impact, that they were still central in your emotional world. When you withdraw that emotional energy, you remove a source of regulation they may not even have consciously recognized they were relying on. This is where projection begins to unravel. For years, perhaps, they labeled you as dependent, yet now they find themselves checking your social media, wondering who you are with, imagining whether you think about them, feeling restless when there is no signal from you. That restlessness is attachment surfacing. And attachment, when it contradicts one's self-image, creates tension. Psychologically, this is a collision between persona and reality. The persona says, I don't need anyone. The nervous system says, I feel the loss. The persona says, they were replaceable. The body says, something is missing. That dissonance can feel like irritation, anger, even sudden attempts to reassert contact, not necessarily because they want intimacy, but because they want relief from the discomfort of being the one who feels unsettled. There is something deeply human about dependency. We all rely on connection. We all co-regulate emotionally to some extent. But healthy maturity involves acknowledging, and that reliance without shame, for someone structured around superiority and self-sufficiency. Acknowledging emotional need can feel humiliating. So instead of recognizing I am experiencing attachment, they may externalize it as they're playing games or they're trying to provoke me. But the silence is not a game. It is a boundary, and boundaries reveal who is leaning more heavily on whom. And boundaries reveal who is leaning more heavily on whom. This is often the hidden irony. The empath, who is accused of being overly emotional, begins to stabilize and grow stronger in solitude. Meanwhile, the one who claimed detachment begins to experience unease in the absence of attention. Not because they loved in a deep, integrated way, because they relied on being psychologically centered in your life. When that centering disappears, they are forced into an unfamiliar position, not as the pursued, not as the superior figure, but as someone who feels. And, feeling without control, can resemble psychological exposure. There is no script for this, no easy narrative to protect the ego. Just an internal awareness that the connection mattered more than they admitted, perhaps even to themselves. In that awareness lies an uncomfortable truth. Independence that depends on domination is not independence at all. It is dependency disguised as power. And when the disguise falls, what remains is not superiority but vulnerability. The most unsettling part of this experience is not losing you. It is discovering that they were not as unaffected as they believed. And that realization, quietly and persistently, can become its own form of reckoning. Because nothing destabilizes false strength more than the undeniable experience of one's own need. Finally, there is a stage that is both inevitable and profoundly transformative in this dynamic, the confrontation with reality itself. After all the manipulation, all the tie-in strategizing, all the attempts to control perception, the narcissist is ultimately forced to inhabit a truth they cannot rewrite. When an empath walks away and maintains their boundaries, The narcissist is left with the stark reality of their own choices, and it is here that the psychological hell fully emerges. For a narcissist, much of their psychological framework is built on illusion. The illusion of control, the illusion of indispensability, the illusion that others orbit around them as the central figure of emotional gravity. Their interactions are often performances, carefully orchestrated to reinforce a sense of power and superiority. But when the empath disengages, none of the usual scripts work. No charm, no guilt, no grand gestures, no manipulative reasoning. None of it alters the outcome. They are confronted with a reality where they are not central. Points has been rendered irrelevant, where their carefully constructed narratives collide with the simple truth. You chose autonomy over entanglement, self-respect over submission, growth over stagnation, growth over stagnation. This confrontation is psychologically destabilizing because it exposes the gap between the self they project and the self they inhabit. Their inner world, the one where they imagined themselves powerful, controlling, and irreplaceable, begins to fracture. They are left with questions that cannot be answered with manipulation. Was I overconfident? Did I misread the situation? Did I assume too much about my influence? These questions may be suppressed outwardly, but internally they gnaw at the ego. And because narcissistic identity is so heavily invested in external validation, the absence of response, the lack of entanglement, becomes a mirror reflecting their own insufficiency. The empath's disengagement also illuminates an uncomfortable truth. The power they wielded over you was never inherent. It was relational. Their influence depended on your emotional engagement. Once you withdraw that engagement, the scaffolding collapses. The grandiosity that sustained them begins to crumble because it relied entirely on your participation. What remains is vulnerability, a vulnerability they may have never consciously acknowledged, one they may resist facing. Philosophically, this is an encounter with humility and consequence. Every action has an effect. Every decision carries weight. For the narcissist, realizing that their final choice has irrevocable consequences, that they cannot manipulate, charm, or coerce their way back into a world where they are central, is an existential discomfort. It is a confrontation with personal responsibility stripped of illusion. They cannot argue reality into compliance. They cannot gaslight the truth away. They must live with the ramifications of their decisions, unmitigated, unaltered. Meanwhile, the empath flourishes quietly, untouched by their attempts to disrupt, unburdened by their need for validation. The psychological contrast becomes undeniable. One person rebuilds, thrives, and moves forward. The other is trapped within the echo of a self-conceived superiority that no longer resonates outside their own mind. This is the final, inescapable lesson. The narcissist's psychological hell is not created by revenge, confrontation, or external punishment. It is created by the empath's sovereignty, by choosing themselves, their growth, and their boundaries, by walking away and refusing to be drawn back into the orbit of manipulation. The empath forces the narcissist to face a reality they cannot control, a self they cannot sustain, and a world where their perceived power no longer exists. And in that quiet, relentless reality, they are left with something they have never truly faced, the consequences of their own choices, unmitigated by manipulation, unsoftened by guilt, unaltered by illusion. Their final torment is simple yet profound, understanding at last that their influence was never as absolute as they believed, and that life goes on without them.